All right, friends, welcome back to CHRTC 309. Once again, this is Sociology of Youth and Religion. Okay, so where are we at? All right, so basically, in this set of topics, we're going to look at theories of secularization, right? So this is a really long-standing debate in sociology, right? And I alluded to it in the theories a little bit. Whether we are going through what would be called a process of secularization, where basically religion is fading away, right, as rationality and all of these things that we described in some of the, like in Berger's theories and such in the last kind of section, as these things kind of take over, are in society kind of shedding religion. And now there's a few major views of this, which I'll talk about through this, but we can kind of clump them into either, what's kind of the inherited model, right? The classical model would say, yeah, as rationality increases, this basically we're going to get religion disappearing, essentially. And we call it the inherited model because we inherit it from Marx and Durkheim and Weber. Then we have a kind of pushback, right, against this from, some mid-20th century scholars, the most prominent of which is Rodney Stark, who said, no, actually, you've all gotten this completely wrong. There is no secularization happening. It's not a thing. You got it wrong. And then a sort of group of kind of people trying to kind of navigate in the middle, saying, yeah, obviously something has changed, right? Religion plays a different role than it did in the past, but it's not disappearing. And then, kind of other people trying to explain, and again, Rodney Stark plays a big role in this, trying to explain the sort of ebb and flow of religion. And this is sometimes called the self-limiting model of secularization. So we'll go through all of these kind of in turn in the next few lectures. So when we talk about secularization, right, obviously what we are discussing needs to be defined. So secularization, as we're going to define it for the purposes of this course, and as it's basically defined in the sociology of religion, it refers to the decline of religiosity, right? And this is the result of modernity, right? The increasing modernization of society has moved us in this kind of theoretical lens away from religiosity and more towards a kind of non-religious worldview where religion plays a smaller and smaller role. And, Dawson and Thiessen's definition, that secularization refers to the process by which religion and the sacred gradually have less validity, influence, and significance in society and the lives of the individuals, again, through modern processes like rationalization, pluralism, and individualism. So basically, secularization, what it means is in modernity, religion will become less salient. And in the kind of extreme iterations of this, and even sort of the mainstream ones, as late as, say, the 1980s, the assumption essentially was that religion would fade away entirely from the kind of sphere of society, that modernity and modernization were such powerful forces and had so little place for religion that religion would basically disappear. Peter Berger went as far as to say that basically by the beginning of the 21st century, what we should expect was that, and you can find this quote in the Stark piece that's assigned, that, by the beginning of the 21st century, all there would be is a few isolated religious communities somewhere in the world, huddled away, trying to hide from a globalized secular society or civilization, and that religion really had no place in the modern world. So here we get to what's sometimes called the classical or inherited model of secularization. So it's called the inherited model basically because we inherit it principally from Durkheim and Weber, although Marx also, kind of has his hand in that. And basically the thesis of the secularization thesis is that modernity is incompatible with religion. And therefore, as modernity expands its influence, as more of the world becomes modernized, religion will fade and disappear. And this has long been the kind of accepted model of how the world works in sociology. And I think on a popular level, this is still very much the way people understand, the relationship between modernity and,
even at a level where maybe they couldn't articulate it, the relationship between modernity and religion. That basically the two are incompatible, right? As we get a more scientific worldview, religion inherently has to fade and disappear. So what are the kind of key elements of this? Differentiation, as we talked about already, right? You get the development of specific social institutions that take the place of organized religion, education, healthcare, the nation state. All of these things kind of push religion into a smaller and smaller sphere. Rationalization, right? Scientific and rational modes of thinking, which supersede, religious and irrational modes of thinking, at least in this model, right? And I'm not saying that that's how it actually works, but this is the thesis, that basically rationalization will push away and kind of reorganize society along kind of rationalized and non-religious lines and leave less and less space for religion. And then worldliness, right, where people are more grounded in the here and now than in the transcendent, where you basically get, in a sense, people are only worried about the here and now, right? And the transcendent, because it's not part of everyday consciousness, becomes very much secondary. And basically, all of the classical social theories and social theorists, and right up into the 1970s and 80s, this was clearly accepted as what was going to happen. Basically, all sociological theories link secularization and the onset of modernity and suggest that, at some point, as modernity keeps spreading out, religion is doomed and religion is going to go away. So basically, when we talk about the inherited model or the classical model of secularization, the principal evidence that we have, that this is the case, is the transformations that took place in the United States and Europe after the onset of modernity. And here the European data set is often taken as the dispositive one, right? That the one that absolutely 100% shows that secularization is taking place. And basically, what we look at is a couple of things, right? Decreases in church affiliation and attendance are key. Changes in kind of consciousness, as measured in survey data, how important people say religion is to them, how often they pray, how often they read the sacred text, do they consider the sacred text as definitive or divinely authored? All of these things, are taken as evidence. What we tend to see, historically, is that the leading edge of this process has been in Europe, and Europe has moved into, being secular as modernity has progressed. And this has been taken broadly as evidence, right? Basically a suggestion that this thing that happened in Europe is going to happen everywhere. And this is, I think, in a sense, a mistake of the classical secularization model. And this is, I think, a mistake that the West has often made. And it actually comes, both, we see it in a lot of different spheres when it comes to kind of the West assuming that its experience of the transition to modernity is going to be how everyone experiences modernity. So basically the fact that, say, Europe, in a sense, the first place to undergo modernization, quickly thereafter followed by the United States, because it experienced secularization along with modernization, that modernization and secularization are inherently linked. We'll talk about this more when we get to Stark's kind of, rip secularization, or the idea that secularization isn't taking place, at least not in the way that this inherited model tends to articulate. The United States has always offered a bit of a rejoinder to this. The United States has lagged far behind Europe in terms of secularization. But even if we think of other places where kind of the West has assumed that its experience is going to be the model, in terms of what's kind of called the logic of industrialism thesis, what you get with, say, the logic of industrialism thesis is this idea that the endpoint of, essentially the industrialization part of modernity is liberal democracy. And there was long an assumption that, as the West had gone through kind of industrialization, it ended up as a bunch of liberal democracies, that this was going to happen everywhere. So the impetus, say, to industrialize China, starting in the 1980s and going on to the present, was that, eventually what would happen is that industrialization would lead to prosperity, which would lead to democracy. So the West often, I think, makes this mistake of thinking that its kind of model of things and its way, the way it went through things, is the only way things happen. And I think this is the case, with this historical perspective. It takes the evidence of especially Europe and says, well, this has to be the way it's going to be everywhere. So generally speaking, when we talk about secularization theorists, and there are still secularization theorists that have this inherited or classical model, they tend to think that this trend is going to continue into the future, and that as time goes on, there will be less and less religious people. More kind of recent articulations of it, and we'll see this when we talk about Steve Bruce, will say that it's not necessarily a linear process and it doesn't happen evenly, but rather it's an uneven one tempered by local conditions and characteristics. But it is the inevitable result of modernization that societies will become more secular.